Black Doctors Podcast.
Hello, welcome back to the Black Doctors Podcast. I am Steven, your host. Thanks for tuning in for another week. We're here every Monday sharing stories of minority healthcare professionals with the goal of inspiring the next generation. And I definitely appreciate you listening. I am the host. I am the founder, creator of the show. And it really means a lot that you're here. All the month of June, we are celebrating 4 years on the air. Can't believe it's been 4 years. And we're looking forward to, we've hit over 200,000 downloads. The metrics are incredible, inspiring, definitely motivating to continue forward and to keep putting out this content, and because folks are tuning in, listening, and providing really good feedback. So thank you for that. This month, I am jumping off and doing solo episodes. Usually I hide behind my guests. It's a lot easier just kind of telling other people's stories. But this month I've challenged myself to do every episode just as a solo host. Hopefully you've enjoyed the episodes thus far. The first week I was talking mostly about podcast metrics and where the show started from, how we've done over the last couple of years. Some information about how, if you're interested in starting a podcast, how you can do that. So definitely check that out if that's something you're interested in. Last week, I provided some advice for interns and folks kind of starting out in their medical careers, specifically kind of targeting folks leaving medical school going into residency, because we know June is a month of transitions, June and July. Folks are starting in the hospital. So I provided some, I thought it was good advice. Maybe it was too real. I'm not like a academic superstar. I'm a pretty average person. And I feel like, most people in medicine and in life are average. So that's where the advice kind of came from. And hopefully people found that helpful and relevant. This week, I realized, I've somehow managed to avoid sharing my story and how I entered healthcare and became a physician. So I'm going to talk about that. And then I think next week I'll probably talk about my kind of philosophy on medicine and how I maintain good work-life balance, and mostly how I say no to a lot of stuff and only do what I think is important. And I think that'll end the month. Yep, that'll be 4 episodes. So I'm going to jump into my story. First, let's look at some reviews. This review says, great podcast. Look forward to new episodes every week. As a pre-medical student, I enjoy hearing the medical students, residents, and attendings' journey to where they are and their plans for the future. Thank you for that. This review is from a couple years ago. Just listened to the episode about, this won't open, I assume it was military medicine. Continue to investigate medical malpractice within the military. Many of us are suffering injuries that are not included in our medical records. Medical negligence is rampant in the military. Military doctors make rank by manipulating the numbers and taking care of issues in-house, aka avoiding sending service members to qualified professionals. Okay, that episode hit a nerve, and glad whoever heard that benefited from that. Well, let's read one more. Outstanding podcast, the most down-to-earth yet educational podcast of our time. Well, I thank you very much. Absolutely recommend this to anyone interested or who wants to learn more about medicine. Awesome. Thank you all for the rankings. Definitely keep those coming. Again, we've hit over 100 on Apple Podcast. For the numbers, there's over 4 million podcasts in the podcasting space. And out of that 4 million, only 400,000 of those are active. And it's only 40,000 that have an episode that comes out every week. So, we're small fish in a small pond. So we appreciate your support. I'm going to jump into today. So I'm going to share my story, how I ended up in medicine. It starts at the beginning. I'm a Navy brat. It's Father's Day when I'm recording this. Shout out to all you dads out there. I'm a Navy brat. So my dad, he's retired from the Navy now, but he grew up in Orlando. My mom's from South Florida, West Palm Beach area. They were first generation college students. They both kind of worked their way through Florida State using Pell Grants. My parents met in college. After college, my dad ran into some Navy recruiters and then gave him the line, see the world and all that stuff. And he ended up swearing into the Navy, went to officer candidate school, Some of my earliest memories as a kid, I think, were being up in Rhode Island for some of his training. And I remember staying in kind of a hotel, and it was snowing out. I actually still have his hoodie somewhere from his officer's candidate school. So very formative memories. We moved up and down the East Coast mostly, and every couple of years we were changing cities. Fun, exciting, and since that was the way we grew up, I remember just wanting to go into the Navy because that's everything that I saw and everything that I grew up around, and my little brother did as well. So as I was finishing up high school and trying to figure out what I wanted to go into, medicine wasn't really the top of my mind, but I loved music. I had studied music since, probably I was 7 or 8 years old. My parents had me taking piano lessons, and I really enjoyed music, and I figured, hey, this will be a great way to go into the Navy. I could be, a music minister or a band leader, and I'd, join the Navy and follow my dad's footsteps. So I ultimately went to college to study music. I went to a small private liberal arts school as a music major. More specifically, I was a sacred music major, and learning how to be a better musician. I was taking classes on pedagogy and obviously piano classes, and I was leading different orchestral groups. I had classes on directing music, which was a lot of fun. And I was really, really enjoying the major. I had a good buddy, Ben, he was a music major also. I think he was a cellist, but he was studying music. I was studying music. We had a good time. The thing that kind of bothered me was no matter how hard I practiced, because you'd get your song assignments and you'd play them the next week and get graded on them. So no matter how hard I practiced, I would get like a B+ on the piece that I learned. If I barely practiced at all, I might get like a B or a B-. So it didn't take me long to figure out that, I didn't really need to apply myself that much, and I was just kind of skating by as a music major. And I remember kind of sometime in the spring, Ben came up and he was like, oh, hey, yeah, I actually changed my major. I'm going to be pre-med. And I was like, yo, that sounds ridiculous. That's like really hard. It sounds like a lot of work. And that kind of struck me, the comment that I made, because I thought to myself, you're in college, and if you're not here to work, then what are you really here to do? I was having a good time. I was enjoying playing music, but it really wasn't work, and I wasn't applying myself. So seeing him change his major really kind of got me thinking, like, is this the best use of my time? So I finished up my freshman year of college, went back home. My parents were living in Jacksonville. My dad had retired from the Navy at this point in time, and I had to get an odd job right for the summer. So the first job that I was able to get was as a sandwich artist at Subway. So you got to understand, when my parents retired from the Navy, they really wanted they wanted to live in the country. So they kind of lived outside of the city limits of Jacksonville. So it's really country, very rural. And so the Subway was very rural. And when I started working there, I was like the only black dude and the youngest person on staff at the Subway. I don't know if you call it staff or employee or whatever. And I remember there were 4 other women that I worked with. 2 of them were like older and like really country. I think the term would probably be redneck. I doubt that's politically correct now, but that's a term that may have been used to describe these 2 older women. And then the other 2 were younger. They still may have been described as redneck, depending on what the proper nomenclature was. They're also lesbian. And the environment I found myself in was that the 2 older country women hated the 2 younger country lesbians. And they felt the same way about them. Like those 2 groups hated each other. And then there was me stuck in the middle. And I didn't know I probably had a good guess of where I stood with both groups. So I remember, I was working and I had to like learn how to make sandwiches, and it wasn't as easy as it looks when you go in there to Subway. The most annoying people are the ones that are like, I'm really easy, just give me everything, because then they start picking and choosing what they do or don't want off their sandwich. So anyway, I'm working there a week, and then like 2 weeks in, I had to take a test on how to put these sandwiches together and how quickly I could do this work. And I remember, depending on how well I did in this test, I would get like up to a 75-cent raise an hour. And I didn't really study, but it was just like, how much slices of turkey do you put on the sub and cheese, and how quickly do you do it? So this lady graded me on it, and I feel like I performed flawlessly, but she still only gave me like 20-cent raise. And I was like, this is ridiculous. I was a little, cocky, like I'm the only person here that's in college, and this is ridiculous. I'm not being discriminated against. It was Subway, but I'm like, this is not, utilizing my full talent and potential. I just took, all these college level courses as a freshman, and now I'm being graded and getting a B minus on making sandwiches. So that job didn't last super long. I found another guy who was at my church. He owned a construction company doing high voltage electrical work, and I ended up going to work for him. And that was a fun job. He would service like those giant gray towers you see on the side of the road. They do all sorts of high voltage electrical work. And so I would go out there and help them put stuff together and carry conduit, and we'd run electrical wiring. So my first real exposure to medicine was through this job, because we had a gig at the University of Florida College or University of Florida Shands Jacksonville Hospital. So we go down there, we were installing some new AC units or whatever. It was fun. They have a crane out there. We were putting AC units on the roof. But then typically my job was I'd show up at like 5 a.m. I would go down to the basement, and they had a pair of waders, like, straight up hunting waders. They're like overalls, but they're rubber. So I would put on this pair of waders and then pull up a grate in the floor, and there's just like muddy water down there. And I'd have to go down in the sub basement of Shands Hospital in Jacksonville and run electrical conduit, because we were, had to move some wires somewhere. And there was like all kinds of dirty, muddy water down there. There were crawfish. They were like pink and blue crawfish. And it was just very dirty, hot, sweaty work. Anyways, one day, sometime, we came above the surface, and we had to install some electrical wiring and some lights in one of the physician's offices. And that was like, I was like, oh shoot, there's a whole life up here and air conditioning, and I don't actually have to crawl around in the basement. And one of the guys I was working with was like, yeah, if I did it all over again, I would go into medicine. I was like, okay. And that makes a lot of sense. Sounds like a much better job than I'm working right now. So I sat down the rest of the summer, and I sat down and I said, hey, how can I change my major and still graduate? I wanted to graduate in the 4 years, so I didn't run up my cost for college. And I looked into nursing. I was like, maybe nursing's a way. Nursing, I would have had to start all over again, and it would have taken me a full 4 years to graduate. So I settled on pre-physical therapy. They offered that as a major at my school, and I figured the benefits, somebody that kind of always tries to have a plan B. So I was like, if medicine's not for me, I can go into physical therapy. All the prerequisites were the same, or at least the prerequisites I would have needed for medical school, I would have gotten through this pre-physical therapy program. So I changed majors. I went back in the fall. That's what I started. And I remember having these decision points, because organic chemistry, the one that was a pre-med prerequisite, was initially a portion of the pre-physical therapy track. And I started on this program, and that year they changed that to where, hey, pre-physical therapy, you can take like the nursing or organic chemistry. And I remember sitting there, I think Dr. Duran was the professor's name. And she looked at me and she says, hey, you don't need to take this class, right? If you're pre-physical therapy, you can switch to something else. And it was like the easy way out. And she put me on the spot in front of everybody. And I was like, oh no, that's cool. Well, I'm just going to go ahead and take this class anyways. Thank God I did, because it ended up working out. But that's how close, things were. It was a lot of touch and go. So I had to cram a lot of these science courses in. It was just a trial by fire. And I figured I'd step out, take a leap of faith, and see if I was smart enough to actually do this work and get into medical school. And it was extremely, extremely challenging. I finished up that sophomore year of college and then had to go home for the summer. I was incredibly broke. I think this summer, my sophomore year, I worked 2 jobs. One, I had a job at Express selling clothes. And then I had a job with Walgreens. I was actually a business management intern. I don't know if they still have the program, but my dad worked with somebody who was married to the district manager of Walgreens. So definitely like a hookup, that people that don't look like us usually have. So Mr. H ended up helping me get this job. I applied and all that, but I got accepted to this business management internship program. And the benefits were, you work there for the summer and then you can get pushed into like store management positions. I remember I was making probably like $16 or $18 an hour, which was a lot of money at the time, on par for like 36 grand a year. And I was working like 42 hours with Walgreens. Then I'd get off and run over to my job at Express at the mall and I'd work there. So I was kind of double dipping there. And the Walgreens job was great. You're learning to be a manager. I remember one of my very first days, we had an older or middle-aged white store manager at the store I worked at. And a couple of the assistant managers were black. And I remember telling Mr. B, who's a store manager, like, oh, hey, yeah, my dad knows. I started to say something about Mr. H, the district manager that my dad knew that had helped give me the job. So Mr. Q, you're probably barely following the story at this point. Mr. Q was this older black manager. He had left Katrina after the hurricane and relocated to the city. And I just remember him pulling me. He's like, hey, Mr. Bradley, let me talk to you for a second. Because that's all, like, as store managers, or assistant managers, we're all like Mr. Bradley or Mr. Q or Mr. B. That's how they refer to everybody. He said, let me talk to you for a second. So he pulled me into the aisle. It was an aisle with cornflakes on it. And he just like lit into me and was like, hey, I don't ever want to hear you mention this district manager's name again. You got here because you applied for the job and you deserve to be here. So like totally went like old school on me. And I was like, okay, cool. What I came to find out was there's a whole lot of stuff going on about discriminatory hiring policies, and the store manager ended up leaving. There's a whole lot of like systemic issues that were going on with the company at that point that I kind of walked into accidentally. So there was a whole lot of stuff going on. Anyways, I worked at Walgreens for the summer. I came back to school. I still worked at Walgreens. I was able to kind of work and help pay for college. So I was working from my junior and senior year. I was putting in about 35 hours a week working at Walgreens. So I would take my college courses 3 or 4, probably about 3 nights a week. I would pull my car around. I'd park it in front of the dorms because as soon as I got out of my last class, I would book it from class to my car, drive over to Walgreens, change into my uniform in the car, and then close the store. So I'd work from like 4 p.m. until 10 o'clock when the store closed, and I'd count on the registers, lock up, and then head back to campus. And then I would start studying. So 3 nights a week, that's what I did from my junior year and through my senior year. In my senior year, I worked almost every week in my senior year to help pay for school. Along the way, I did do some summer courses so that I could graduate on time. And I also had to do 2 internships, one of which was done at the Andrews Institute. So Dr. James Andrews is a famous orthopedic surgeon. He has his main clinic, I think, in Alabama, and he works on all the big-time athletes. So he had a smaller campus in Pensacola. That's where I was at for school. So I was able to go there, shadow some of his physical therapists. I got to see his surgical suite and see where him and his team operated. And that was really cool, really good experience. And I said, hey, I want to be an orthopedic surgeon. This is it. Physical therapy is great, but I want to be in medicine. I want to be an orthopedic surgeon. And that solidified my plan to apply to medical school. Thankfully, I had good grades. I was able to finish college with a 3.51 GPA. It was right down to the wire. I remember I had one class that I needed an A or whatever to get this 3.5 and above, which is like summa cum laude or something. I don't know. And it was down to the wire when they posted my grades. Because back in the day, we didn't have like Blackboard and all this other fancy stuff. You had to go to the wall where they posted your grades, and then you had to find your student ID number and then look at your grades. So I got that information like right before I walked for graduation. I'm graduating with a 3.51 GPA. As I was heading into that last semester of my senior year, I knew I wasn't ready to take the MCAT. So I went from college to University of South Florida. They had a 1-year master's program where I had a concentration in anatomy. And after college, after graduating in May of 2009, I moved home. I took 8 weeks, so 2 months to study for the MCAT. Didn't know what I was doing, couldn't afford any study materials. I downloaded the Exam Crackers audio from LimeWire. I'm definitely like dating myself. So I downloaded the Exam Crackers audio, and I listened to that for 8 weeks, just again and again and again on repeat. I checked out, usually most libraries have like SAT or an MCAT and GRE prep materials. So I checked out some MCAT prep materials from my local library, worked through those books, and then once a week I would go to the library and take a full-length practice MCAT. So I did that for 8 weeks, did nothing else, just ate and slept. I changed the spark plugs in my car. That was like the one thing I did in the 8 weeks. Took the test, and then started this master's program. The master's program was good. I made some incredible lifelong friends. Ruan, Nadine, Kendra, Shabia, Dashika, shout out to you guys. And we all kind of went our separate ways. A lot of them stayed on for their PhD program. But the master's program was just, a trial by fire. There was a lot of information crammed in that 1 year. And along the way, I was applying to medical school. And I didn't know what I was doing. My parents were first generation college students. I was the first person trying to go to medical school. And I was just making this stuff up as I went along. I remember going to different happy hours with some of my colleagues in grad school, and they would talk about where they were at in the applications process. Like I remember one time I forgot I needed to certify my application, and that delayed everything getting sent in by a couple of weeks. I remember being so discouraged and overwhelmed that I'm like, I don't know how to get a professional headshot for my application. And my friend Love, L-U-V, he was one of my classmates in the master's program, and he happened to like photography. And he's like, hey, bro, I got you. So he came to where I was living at the time, took a headshot, he edited it for me and sent it to me. I was able to use that to apply to medical school. I only had enough money to apply to the 6 medical schools in Florida. There were like 6 at the time. So I did that. And then it just so happened I was also still working at Walgreens. I transferred to another Walgreens that was down in Tampa. And there was a Black woman secretary that was part of the master's program. And she knew that I was working. She really looked out for a lot of the underrepresented students. And she called me to the office one day and was like, hey, I know you're working and you're struggling to keep up. How much is Walgreens paying you? Would you keep working there if I could provide, if you received a scholarship that covered this same amount of money? And I was like, yeah, absolutely not. So she was able to find a scholarship that I was eligible for based upon my GRE score, and that covered my tuition for the master's program, so I didn't have to pay for that. With those funds, I was able to apply to 6 more medical schools, which included Howard University. Ended up going up there to interview and was ultimately accepted to Howard. And the only reason I all these different fortuitous circumstances, whether it's God looking out, fate, I like to say the good Lord looks out for babes and fools, because there was a lot of places in my journey that I could have easily taken a turn for the worst and not made it to where I am today. So I'm eternally grateful for the way everything has turned out. So summer of 2010, I finished up my master's program and then moved up to DC, started at Howard. That was one of the best experiences of my life. I met lifelong friends. Being able to train at a historically Black university with such a rich cultural history, the professors that I worked under looking like me and providing that rich history and the legacy. I worked under Dr. LaSalle Lafall, who was the first Black president of the American College of Surgeons and the first Black president of the American Cancer Society. And then his mentor was Dr. Charles Drew. And it was just like the highest level of standards, and you wanted to impress these people. Dr. Alice Galati, she was a psychiatrist that helped start the SNMA. And, she was kind of old and decrepit by the time I came through. She walked around like hunchback with a little cane, and she had a station wagon. that was like straight up off of Hoarders, because she just had so much stuff jammed in that little car, and you see her like driving by. But, you would see her roaming the hallways and seeing patients, and it was just such a rich legacy. Dr. Cornwell from general surgery, he was a trauma surgeon and, had some wild grand rounds. And Dr. Wendy Green was one of my attendings. It was just such an awesome experience to be there and to learn and to live in DC. DC was a vibe. So great times at Howard. I was exposed to anesthesia there. My buddy Brandon Dyro, one of my classmates, he was kind of put me on. He's like, yo, anesthesia is like legit. You make a lot of money and you wear scrubs all day. It's pretty chill. So I'm like, okay, it might be something to it. So going into my third year, I'd started med school like intent on being an orthopedic surgeon because that's what I saw at the Andrews Institute. It didn't take me long to see the other orthopedic surgeons in my class, like people that wanted to go ortho. I'm like, okay, that's not really my vibe. They were super intense and they were on top of their game. And I was like, just barely getting by. I just liked so many other things besides medicine. So throughout medical school, I actually was playing on my church's praise and worship team. So at least twice a month, I would play like the Saturday service and then 3 services on Sunday. We had like 600 people per service, and I would play keyboard or bass. So I was always doing that. We had our Howard University College of Medicine gospel choir, never to be confused with the Howard University gospel choir. There's levels of talent that were different, but we did make a joyful noise. So I could never really go 100% in on my medical school classes. I always have to have some sort of balance or distraction. I just can't, like for me, if I'd made perfect scores, but not had a life outside of medical school, like I wouldn't have been happy with that. And so I was always a bit distracted. Long story short, I wasn't like making ortho grades in school. And I figured I'd go into third year, do the rotations, keep an open mind. I had anesthesia as a plan B. It wasn't as competitive as it is now back then. So I started off with pediatrics. That was my first experience. Oh my God. I think we rounded for like that first day on rounds. We were standing up for 2 hours straight, and I'm second guessing like everything in my life. Like, why did I choose to do this? But realized peds wasn't for me. Went through OB, went through surgery. I was actually really like feeling general surgery and thought about doing that, but then found out that I could do critical care, which I fell in love with on my surgical rotation. I found out I could do critical care through anesthesia. I actually sat down with Dr. Wendy Green. I think she's at Emory now. She was at Howard at the time, Black woman, trauma surgeon. And I remember one weekend we were in the OR together. I was holding the camera. She was doing a lap chole. And I was thinking, oh my God, like, I like the operating room, but this whole holding the camera and operating, I don't know that I could do this every day for a career. And I didn't tell her that, but afterward, at some point, we sat down and talked, and I told her I really liked critical care medicine. And she was like, okay, well, there's a number of different ways that you can do critical care medicine. You can do it from internal medicine. You can do it from surgery. You can do it from anesthesia. And I was like, okay, cool. So like that kind of put 2 of my interests together. And that's when I decided like I'm going to try to apply for anesthesia. As fortune would have it, the annual American Society of Anesthesiologists conference was in DC that year as a third year. So I was able to walk down from where I was living at the time and attend the conference. And then I went to, I think, the SNMA conference. It may have been in Indianapolis that year. And I met for the second time the folks from University of Chicago Medical Center, Dr. Mike Hernandez. He was the program director at the time. I remember like this one like skinny older white dude sitting there at SNMA drinking his Diet Coke, and we struck up a conversation. And I remember going into fourth year, I was able to apply for a scholarship that covered an away rotation. So I was able to go out to UC Davis and rotate there. I always look up, graduates from Howard and where they're at. There was a Howard grad that was a resident there at the time. So I went out there for the month. the ASA conference was in San Francisco that year. So I was able to rent a car, drive over to San Francisco and attend the conference, and met Dr. Hernandez for the third time. And I just remember that year I was able to collect so many different interview invitations just by visiting the conference. The landscape's changed a little bit since then. But long story short, I talked to my program director like 3 times before I got the interview. Everything worked out. I ended up going to University of Chicago because they have a fantastic critical care program. Anesthesia residency was amazing also, and had a fantastic time. I think I have a lot of folks on from University of Chicago because it was just such a impactful experience for me. Such a diverse program, diverse city, and I don't even have enough time to talk about to extol the virtues of University of Chicago Medical Center and what it means for my training. I joined the Navy, finally kind of came full circle and was able to follow that initial dream that I had. My brother had already joined because he did ROTC in college. So I was able to serve for 4 years on active duty, took some nice family photos and uniforms and all that stuff, and then went back to University of Chicago for my ICU fellowship before coming down to Tampa to practice. So that is my story. That's how I came to be where I'm at. I think in the first episode of this month, I really talked about how I was intentional about using the free time that I had while on active duty in the Navy to build something that could help people, that could help. I essentially built this podcast for Stephen, for the student that I was when I was coming out of undergrad and starting medical school and had no idea what was out there. I didn't know going to medical school, like all of the different specialty options. And I know a lot of other people are there. And so my goal of the podcast is to provide information, have these conversations, have these stories of like, hey, yo, Dr. Bradley struggled. We don't know how he made it. I don't know how I made it sometimes. And that is really the goal behind the podcast. But I talk more about that in the first episode from the month of June, where I talk about, I had so much time and how do I build this. So for the first time, this was my story. You get it here first for free. I don't know, maybe I'll write a book at some point if people are interested in reading everything I just talked about. But happy to be here, happy to share the things that I've learned in my journey. And thank you for hanging out, for listening. Always happy to answer questions if you have any. Thanks for tuning in this week for the podcast. Special shout out to TrueLearn. They are sponsoring the show. They are a fantastic resource for people in residency. There are several specialties. They provide test banks for in-training exam questions. I know it's for anesthesia because I used it myself. General surgery, a couple other specialties. They also have resources for allied health professionals like nurse practitioners and PAs. So check them out. If you go to the show notes, there is a link there, and you can use that link to get a discount if you purchase some of their products. So thank you, TrueLearn, for supporting our show. If you haven't already, please leave us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you're listening to podcasts. Definitely reach out with any words of encouragement. I'm going to try to start sharing those on the show more frequently. Appreciate your support. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Black Doctors Podcast. We're here because representation matters.